Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Beast II, build log part 16. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention something amazing that happened for SingularityComputers recently. I got a shout out in Maximum PC magazine. I'm not sure if all of you know about Maximum PC's dream machine, but basically every year, and they've been doing this for a long time, they build the ultimate system. So they go all out, water cooling, enthusiast components, basically as high end as you can get. Now, I've been reading Maximum PC magazine since high school, and I remember looking at the Dream Machine in high school and drooling over it, just thinking I would love to build something like that one day. And it turns out that Maximum PC has actually watched my videos. They've seen Client Build 4 and in particular Client Build 5, which was Nighthawk. And they've actually taken inspiration and ideas from those two builds for the Dream Machine. And they gave me a massive shout out. They've put the link to my channel. So this is in the September issue of Maximum PC. And yeah, it's in the Dream Machine section. So make sure you check that out. It's just incredible. I didn't realize the impact that my channel is having. So this is really exciting for me, and it gives me a lot of enthusiasm to continue making videos, building systems, and working hard on my channel. Okay, I'm going to get straight into it now because I have a lot to cover. At the end of the last video, I filled the loop with Mayhem's X1 UV Red, but I said that I was going to run two different coolant colors in this build, and I have a number of different reasons for doing this. Mainly it's for my upcoming review on Mayhem's coolant. So it's just to give people a look at what different coolant colors look like in the same build. And I'm also testing the performance difference between Mayhem's Pastel and Mayhem's X1, because Pastel is actually a nanofluid. And nanofluids are supposed to have a higher thermal conductivity, which means better performance from your water cooling loop. So I'm going to cover those results in this build log and also in my upcoming review on Mayhem's coolant. Okay, I also mentioned previously that I was going to talk about a problem that I had with one of the components after I filled the loop. Now keep in mind, the only reason I'm talking about problems that I've had is to put the information out there for people, because that's what I'm doing in these videos. That's really the entire point of my channel, to share information. If I have a problem with one of my builds with a component, I will talk about it. Some of you may have already noticed what the problem is. Take a look at the color of the coolant through the tubing compared to the color of the coolant through the rest of the components. The tubing is losing its color, it's clouding. It's going a whitish color. And this is a sign that the tubing is breaking down. Now, this is a well-known problem and it's unavoidable. Tubing will inevitably start to break down, lose its color and cloud after a given time. Now, with colored tubing, it's actually not noticeable until it's really well advanced. But with clear tubing, even the slightest discoloration, you are going to immediately notice it. The problem here is not that the tubing is clouding, because as I said, that's unavoidable. It's that it is clouding far too quickly. I mean, this system, I noticed the discoloration within 4 hours of having the loop up and running, and it's only been up and running for 2 to 3 days now, and it's getting rapidly worse. Now, I actually used an older batch of tubing in the last two builds that I did, and I didn't notice this problem. Now, before I go any further, I just need to say that I've noticed this with a whole bunch of different tubing brands. I know there's going to be people jumping to conclusions and saying, oh, it's because you're using this particular tubing. But there's also been, reports from reputable sources that this is happening to a whole bunch of different tubing brands. So at this point in time, I know what's happening to the tubing. It's starting to break down, and it's breaking down very quickly, but I don't know why, and I'd like an explanation. And because of this, I'm going to start my own testing. I'm going to test a whole bunch of different tubing brands. It's going to take me some time to complete the testing, but when I do, I will talk about it in a future video. Now there's something else that I've seen test results that prove this. I've heard reports of this. I've actually never seen it myself in any of my water cooling loops though. When the tubing breaks down, it can actually leach something called plasticizer, which is an ingredient used in the manufacture of tubing. Not all tubing, you can get plasticizer free tubing and tubing made from different plastics, but all of the major tubing brands that we use for water cooling have plasticizer in them. So the coolant carries the plasticizer around the water cooling loop. It then builds up in tight spots, water blocks for example, and in serious cases it can even completely block a loop. So it's highly likely that plasticizer is the sole cause of buildup in water cooling loops. So not premixed coolants or dyes. And this is one of the things that I'm going to try to find out a lot more about in my testing. Now, most of you should know that a water cooling loop requires a certain amount of maintenance. I mean, most people know that you need to change your coolant from time to time, but it's also extremely important that you change your tubing, because in a lot of cases the tubing doesn't last as long as the coolant. And from what I've told you, it can not just affect the aesthetics of your water cooling loop, but also the performance. The only way that you can work with this problem currently is through maintenance. If you see problems with your tubing, and this goes for any component in your water cooling loop, if there's a problem, you need to change it. Hopefully the manufacturers figure out what is going on and they fix this problem. Okay, my solution to this problem, as well as the testing that I've mentioned, is to just continue changing the tubing until I find tubing that I have no problems with. So the next tubing that I'm going with is Master Clear UV Blue, and I'm going to use it in combination with Mayhem's Pastel Ice White Coolant. Now I'm actually going to add some blue dye to the coolant, so it's going to be a very slight blue tinge, almost unnoticeable though. And I'm also going to add some Mayhem's Clear UV Blue dye so that the coolant glows blue under a UV light like the tubing. I love this combination. I've been wanting to do it for a fair while now. I think it looks incredible. It's like a frosty cold white. And I'm actually going to still use white LEDs in the water block, so it's going to have that radioactive white effect. And then in the rest of the build, I'm going to use UV lights so it glows blue. Okay, this is what it looks like without a UV light. So you can see that the tubing is clear, and the coolant, at this point you can't actually see the blue tinge. I actually go on to add more blue dye after this to make the blue tinge easily visible. Okay, I'm now in the process of draining the Mayhem's X1 UV red coolant from the loop. Most of the loop actually has distilled water in it now. I'm in the process of flushing it out. And I'm just going to give you a quick look at the tubing. So this piece of tubing has been flushed with distilled water, it's empty of coolant, and you can see that not only is it clouded, it is severely stained. Now, staining is also a well-known problem that is unavoidable. If you're going to use colored premixed coolants and dyes, you're going to stain your components, but from my experience, staining is not a problem. If you're going to replace your coolant with the same color, then you don't even have to worry about it because you won't be able to see it. If you have staining, there's a number of ways of removing it. Worst case, you may have to pull apart your blocks and give them a scrub. But there's a number of products you can use, vinegar, lemon juice, and they will remove staining. But so far, out of all the systems I've built, I've just removed staining by flushing out the loop with distilled water. So you can see the nice new clear piece of Tygon tubing there. That's what the tubing is supposed to look like, and that's what it looked like 2 to 3 days ago when I filled the loop. Now, removing staining from tubing is not really possible. Once tubing is stained, it needs to be replaced. The problem here again is not that the tubing is stained, it's that the tubing is stained far too quickly. Okay, don't laugh anyone, I'll get annoyed. It's been over a week now since I last filmed, And as you can see, I've replaced the coolant with Mayhem's Pastel Ice White. I've also replaced the Tygon tubing with Master Clear UV blue tubing. And I think the moral to this story is don't change your coolant color, because there will be remnants of the old coolant. Now, I already knew that I already knew that I might run into these kinds of problems, but the thing is, I spent so much time flushing out the loop. I ran distilled water in the loop for a couple of days. I spent an entire day running water through it, into a container. I put a lot of time into flushing it. I was confident that there was no red, but somehow there must be remnants of red coolant. I'm thinking that it's not remnants of the Mayhem's red coolant, because I only ran that for 2 days. It's most likely the Fezzer UV red coolant that I ran for over 6 months previously. Now, a lot of these components are actually new. I've replaced a lot of these components since the Fezzer red UV coolant, but the radiators I haven't, as well as the graphics card, water box, and a couple of other components. But I'm thinking that the remnants of the Fezzer red UV coolant are in the radiators. What really gets me though is that you can't see the remnants of red coolant in the Mayhem's Pastel Ice White, because I can tell you Pastel Ice White is the purest white. If there's any color, you can see it in Pastel Ice White. You can see it has a slight blue tinge. It took less than a drop of blue dye to get that blue tinge, and there's about 2 liters of coolant in this loop, so about half a drop, just to give you an idea. The other thing that gets me is tubing is not supposed to stain this quickly. I noticed the staining even in the Master Clear within hours. So there's something wrong there as well. I'm thinking possibly some kind of chemical reaction, who knows? But hopefully through my testing that I mentioned that I'm going to do of different tubing brands, I can possibly figure out what's going on here with the staining also. Anyway, what I'm going to do about this is, as I said, continue changing the tubing until I find tubing that this doesn't happen to. I'm now going to move on to some tubing called Duraline. I've known about this for quite some time, and I've heard a lot of good reports about it, so I have high hopes for this tubing. Now, the new fans have arrived, so what I'm going to do is, when I change the tubing, I'm going to take the opportunity to also change the fans. So right now I'm going to get started on changing the tubing, fans, and coolant, and I'm also going to reconfigure the fans and rewire them to work properly with the Aquaero. So I have all of the case panels off, ready to go, and I'm going to get stuck in because I have a lot of work ahead of me. Okay, you can see I have everything set up here, ready to drain the water cooling loop. So I have a piece of tubing hooked up to the tap going down into a container. So this is all it takes. It's very quick and easy to drain the loop. So now just removing the lid from the res. Wow, that tubing is badly stained. But as you can see, as I said, none of the other components are stained except for the tubing. And I'll show you the coolant shortly in the container. It is definitely not red, it's blue. If there was any remnants of red coolant in that loop, you would be able to see it in the white coolant. The white coolant would go pink. There is absolutely no doubt about that. Okay, as you can see, the drainage system in this build works really well. It drains almost all of the coolant from the loop. I end up with a little bit stuck in the top 2 radiators and also a little bit in the lower radiator. But I can drain this by just slightly tilting the build. I then flush the rest of the coolant from the loop using distilled water. I just undo the quick disconnect around the back of the build and syringe the distilled water in through either side of this quick disconnect. So, you know, the top side gets the top two radiators and one half of the loop. The lower side gets the lower radiator and the other half of the loop. So, I think I've talked enough about the tubing at this point. I'll let you draw your own conclusions, hopefully taking into consideration everything that I've said. But you can see this tubing looks very similar to what the Tygon tubing looked like. This tubing hasn't really clouded very much at all though. It's really just staining, but the staining is severe. And the loop has only been up and running 4 or 5 days at this point, so it happened very quickly and it's getting worse rapidly. Okay, moving on to the fan that I've decided on to replace the Noctua NFF12s. This is the Noiseblocker Black Silent Pro PLPS. Now I know a lot of you wanted me to use the new Corsair fans, but you're not going to be able to see much of the fans in this build anyway. In the top two radiators, the fans are completely covered by dust filters. On the bottom radiator, the fans are upside down, so it turns out you actually wouldn't be able to see the colorings on the Corsair fans anyway, and you'd hardly be able to tell, you know, what kind of fan they are. I'm going to talk more about why I chose this fan later in the build log, but certainly one of the reasons is that I love the aesthetics of Noiseblocker fans, and that's why I've used them in a lot of builds previously. Also because they are an extremely silent premium fan. So it's a PWM fan with an RPM of 600 to 1500. It has a 6-year warranty. It has a static pressure of 1.833 millimeters H2O, 23.5 to 58.86 CFM, and 8 to 24 decibels noise output. Okay, included with the fan is a 500mm PWM extension cable. As you can see, the sleeving and heat shrink is high quality. Sleeving is very dense, you can't see through it. It also has black connectors. There's also a 200mm extension cable. As well as that, there is a rubber silencer. Now, this silencer is a premium silencer. The design is just so much better than the usual ones you see. It actually fits into the fan, so it doesn't move, because that's normally the problem with these rubber silencers. They move, they go into the fan blades, and you know, they look terrible because they hang out. The fan also includes premium mounting hardware, M3 bolts that go all the way through the fan. You can see it's all black, and also a Noiseblocker case badge. So now for a look at the fan itself. Now, the reason I like the aesthetics so much is because they are subtle and elegant, and that's why I like to build my systems. Nothing about them really stands out too much. They'll just blend into the build nicely. You can see that the fan blades are smoked. They're slightly transparent. It's a very dark smoke, and I think that just looks awesome. They're also extremely glossy. You know, they don't really look like much, but that's the whole point. You can also see they have a very short cable, which is great because it means you can use whatever length extension cable you need. You're not stuck with a extension cable that is too long. And you can also see the black PWM connector. Okay, I'm all done. All I need to do now is fill the water cooling loop. So I decided to skip me changing out the tubing, the fans, and reconfiguring the fans to work with the Aquaero, because I thought it would just be, you know, really straightforward and boring. I've also shown you before in this build log and other build logs. But anyway, as you can see, all of the fans are in, and I think they just look amazing. You know, a lot of the build is black now, so it has a really stealthy look, and the coolant is going to be an amazing contrast to that. So the Duralene tubing is in, as you can see, and I really like the look of this tubing also. It has a slight blue tinge, but once there's fluid in the tubing, you can't actually see the blue tinge. It's extremely transparent. It has a lot of clarity. It's about as thick as Master Clear tubing, but it's a lot more flexible. I would say in flexibility, it's somewhere between Master Clear and Tygon. It also is difficult to kink. I would say kink resistance is quite similar to Taiwan, maybe even a bit better. So you can see there how transparent it is, and that's with distilled water in it. So I'm really happy with everything. I hope that I don't have the same problems with the Duralene tubing though. So I have some coolant mixed up, ready to go. This is just pure Mayhem's pastel ice white. I haven't mixed any dyes with it, and I'm not going to this time with the problems that I've had with staining. I just want to leave dyes out for now. Okay, I mentioned previously that I was going to get a dedicated external power supply for my pumps for leak testing. So here it is. It's made by Phobia. As you can see, it's very similar to a laptop power adapter. You can see the specifications there. Basically, it just has a power plug on one side, and on the other side it has a single Molex connector. So this means that you don't have to jumpstart power supplies. You don't have to use the power supply in your system and disconnect all of the power. It really gives you a lot more space to work with on your desk, because some of you might remember how I used to do things. I used to use a cheap power supply and short it out, jump start it. There was cables everywhere. So this is a lot easier way of doing things, and it was actually really cheap too. I think it was less than $20, so definitely worth it. Because it has a single Molex connector and I'm running 2 pumps, I had to use a Molex splitter. So that's just a Bitfinex Alchemy Molex splitter. So it's all set up and ready to go. Now I'll give you a good look around the build once it's all up and running. You can see that I have paper towels in position. As I always say, these are just a precaution, just in case of a leak. You always want to take every precaution that you possibly can when you're filling a water cooling loop, and leak testing is part of this. Okay, I'm just getting started on filling the water cooling loop. I'm going to show the entire process, but I had to time-lapse most of it. Okay, I mentioned previously in this build log that I was going to talk about the different things that people use for coolant and the different results of that. So premixed coolants, distilled water on its own, distilled water with a biocide, which is what a lot of people use, distilled water with silver, different additives, because there's a lot of apprehension, as I mentioned, when it comes to premixed coolants, because there's a lot of hearsay about how they clog water cooling loops. But there's also the problem of corrosion, which a fair amount of people are having. But I've decided to leave this subject for my Mayhem's coolant review, which I have coming up, because it's quite a lengthy subject. A lot of people ask me why I use a syringe to fill water cooling loops, why I don't use a process that is a bit faster. The answer is that a syringe gives me a massive level of control. I can put a tiny bit of coolant into the loop down to drops, whereas a lot of other solutions just really put the coolant in too fast, and you end up having spills and leaks. Okay, there it is, full circulation. Now it's just a matter of getting all of the air out of the loop. And as I've mentioned previously, with the BitsPower Upgrade Kit 150, this takes quite some time. But I also said that it's completely worth the extra time that it takes because of how awesome the BitsPower Upgrade Kit 150 looks. The aesthetics are just so much cleaner. And what I'm talking about here, for those of you that don't know, the BitsPower Upgrade Kit 150 is basically gives you the ability to mount a reservoir onto the BitsPower dual and single D5 pump tops. So the reason I always show this part of a build, the filling of the loop, is because a lot of people ask for it. I know a lot of people find this part of building a water cooling system interesting and exciting. So now I'm just going to run the loop for a few hours to leak test it and to get most of the air out. I will then remove all of the paper towels, hook the pumps back up to the power supply inside the build, put all the panels back on and boot the system. And when I do that, I'll give you a good look around. I woke up this morning and the loop has turned blue. No, I'm just kidding, but this is going to sound just as crazy and confusing. I was actually intending on running 3 different coolant colors in this build right from when I started the rebuild. And I've already talked about the reasons that I'm doing this. It's mainly for my upcoming review on Mayhem's coolant. So I wanted to keep it as a surprise. You know, I kept the second color as a surprise. So first of all, I ran red and then white. And yeah, I wanted to keep the third color as a surprise also. Mainly because this color scheme is to go in combination with something that I'm going to get painted on the side panel. And I'm really excited about it. I think if it's done right, it could just look amazing. It's an idea that I've had right back since I started my business. Now, I'll see if some of you can guess what I'm going to get airbrushed on the side panel. But the only clues that I'll give you is that it goes perfectly in combination with this color scheme, with the dark colors. Now, don't judge this color scheme until I finish the build. I know there's a lot of dark colors in this build now, and there's not enough contrast at this point in time. You know, there's a lot of black. Now that the fans are black, now that I've swapped to the Noiseblocker fans, it's almost all black, and then I've gone and put a dark colored coolant in there, so it all just kind of blends into the background. I always use at least one component in a build to create contrast. If I have an all black build like this, I would normally use the coolant. So I'd go for something like white coolant to create a massive contrast so that the components really stand out. But this time I'm going to have to use the lighting to create contrast, because I needed to go for this color scheme because of what I'm getting painted on the side panel. So I really didn't have a choice there. So the lighting is going to create the contrast. So I just threw some white LEDs into the CPU water block just to show you what I mean by this. You can see that it's creating a kind of frosty, cold blue. And I'm actually going to darken up the color of the coolant. This coolant is Mayhem's X1 UV blue. It's not quite dark enough in combination with white lights. So I'll add a few drops of blue coolant, of blue dye, and that should darken it up nicely. And I'm going to have white LEDs in the CPU and memory water blocks, and then I'm going to have probably white LED strips around the build. I might experiment with some UV lighting and maybe some other colored lighting as well, but yeah, it's all to go in combination with what's on the side panel, so I'll make sure that the lighting works with that also. Now, I actually intended on changing the coolant colors over a much longer time period, but because of all the problems that I've had with the tubing, I've ended up changing the colors a lot quicker. The main reason that I've gone through 3 coolant colors is for my upcoming review on Mayhem's coolant. I really wanted to do something big for this review. I just thought I'd mention that all of the coolant that I'm draining from Singularity Beast II, I'm going to use in personal projects that I have coming up. I already have the builds in mind actually that I'm going to use the coolant in, and I will be dyeing some of the coolant different colors. Now, for those of you who want to know what happened to the Duraline tubing that I used in combination with the Mayhem's Pastel Ice White, it actually went fairly well. It only stained very slightly, and I'm being extremely fussy here. I had to put all of my filming lights on it and look at it really closely, and I can only just see very slight staining. So it actually really wasn't a problem. It was unnoticeable, and that was after 4 to 5 days of having the system up and running. Okay, this has been an extremely long video, so I better start wrapping it up. But you can see I've installed all of the Noiseblocker fans. All of the fans are configured to work properly with the Aquaero 5 Pro. So I have 16 fans connected to the Aquaero. 12 of them are radiator fans, 4 of them are case fans. They are all Noiseblocker Black Silent Pro PLPS fans. The Aquaero 5 Pro only has 4 fan channels, so it's 4 fans per channel, but it can easily handle it. Currently the fans are sitting on 80% because I've actually set up fan curves, and the fan curves are based on the coolant temperature, and the build is just so incredibly quiet. The fans go right down to 30% of their RPM, and you know, it's whisper quiet. The Aquaero 5 Pro is difficult to set up and configure and use, but once you figure it out, it works really well. And I'm going to talk a lot more about it, so don't worry, I'm going to give you all the details on how I set it up, how I have it configured, how to use it. I'm going to talk more about it in this build log, and I'm also going to do a separate video. I'm actually going to do a beginner's guide to the Aquaero because there's definitely not enough information out there about it. And you know, it's also extremely complex, and I think these things are what really puts a lot of people off. But I can tell you, once you have the firmware up to date software, it works really well, or it has for me. So I will, you know, run you through all of that in the upcoming videos. Okay, I'm going to give you a much better look around the system in the next video, because yeah, by that time I should have the rest of the components. I still have to install the AX1200i, the hot swap bays, redo the wiring. So once the build is finished, I'll obviously give you a full and detailed look around, talk about all of the components and specifications, and then I'll move on to the performance and temperature results. So there's still a lot to cover. I also intend to upgrade the graphics cards at some point in this build also. But I better leave this video here. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and favorite if you want to see more.